Welcome to the Articles About Revenge channel, where we bring you the most gripping stories of betrayal, justice, and ultimate triumph. If you're a fan of watching the underdog rise and the greedy fall, you're in the right place. Don't go anywhere, because today's story is a masterpiece of tactical justice that you truly have to hear to believe. Without further ado, let's get right into it. This is 3 years after being kicked out. My ex-in-laws fall to their knees, seeing me at the Federal Gala. Sign the papers, Cassandra, or I'll ensure you spend the next decade drowning in legal fees until you're left with nothing but the clothes on your back. My husband threatened, his voice dripping with a cold, calculated malice I'd never seen before. We were standing in the grand foyer of the historic Savannah mansion that I had meticulously restored with my own hands and my mother's inheritance money. My husband Dominic stood there with a smug grin, flanked by his mother and younger sister, who were already eyeing my heirloom furniture like vultures circling a carcass. They truly believed that by forcing me to sign this document, they were stripping me of my power, my dignity, and my future. They expected me to collapse, to sob, and to beg for a roof over my head in the freezing Georgia rain. They couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't shed a single tear as the pen moved across the parchment. I simply placed the keys to the heavy oak doors on the marble console, picked up my lone suitcase, and walked out into the storm without a backward glance. They didn't realize that the very empire they thought they were seizing was built on a foundation they never understood. As I started my car, I could hear them celebrating inside, unaware that the clock was already ticking on their downfall. Little did they know that 3 years later we would meet again, not in this house, but at a high-stakes federal gala in Washington, D.C., honoring the nation's most influential billionaires. And in that moment, as they fall to their knees, begging for the very mercy they denied me, they will finally realize the terrifying truth: I didn't just survive. I became the one who owns their entire world. Before we dive into how I turned their greed into my greatest victory, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of this journey from betrayal to ultimate power. Trust me, the ending of this story provides a level of justice you have to see to believe. Now let's go back to where the cracks in my marriage first began to show. 6 years ago, I believed I had found my sanctuary in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia. I was 31, a rising star in the world of high-end antique restoration, and newly orphaned after my mother's long battle with cancer. Dominic Montgomery walked into my studio like a character from a classic Southern novel, tailored linen suit, a charming drawl and eyes that seemed to reflect a deep understanding of my grief. He was a local real estate broker who claimed to specialize in preserving the soul of the South. Looking back, I realize he was only interested in the gold buried within it. Our whirlwind romance felt like a dream, and when he suggested we tear up our prenuptial agreement on our first anniversary to prove our undying trust, I let my heart override my professional instincts. I didn't see the red flags then, like the way he constantly checked the price tags on my vintage jewelry, or how he always seemed to have an excuse for why his commission checks were delayed. The reality of the Montgomery family began to seep into our lives shortly after his mother, Lydia Montgomery, and his younger sister, Skylar Montgomery, moved into my 4-story Victorian home. Lydia arrived with 22 suitcases and a sense of entitlement that could bankrupt a small nation. She insisted that as a descendant of the Old South, she couldn't possibly be expected to live in a house without a full-time housekeeper and a premium subscription to every luxury catalog in existence. Dominic conveniently forgot to mention that his family's ancestral fortune had been dried up for decades, leaving them with nothing but a prestigious last name and a mountainous pile of credit card debt. I became the silent engine powering their lavish lifestyle, working 80-hour weeks in my workshop, while Lydia spent my earnings on artisanal organic teas and gold-leafed picture frames for portraits of ancestors who probably wouldn't have liked her much anyway. Dominic, meanwhile, had perfected the art of busyness without ever actually doing business. He spent his mornings at the country club, claiming he was networking with high net worth individuals, which usually just meant drinking expensive scotch on my tab. Whenever I brought up our dwindling savings account, he would kiss my forehead and tell me I was worrying my pretty little head over nothing. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. He once spent $15,000 on a vintage Rolex because he claimed a broker who didn't look successful would never close a $1 million deal. That deal, of course, never materialized, but the watch remained firmly on his wrist, a shiny trophy of his incompetence funded by my sweat and labor. The family dynamic was even more exhausting due to Lydia's blatant favoritism towards Skylar. At 24, Skylar was a professional, aspiring someone, transitioning from a failed interior designer to a struggling life coach within weeks, all while refusing to even load a dishwasher. Lydia treated her like a fragile porcelain doll, constantly reminding me that Skylar was sensitive and needed my financial support to find her true calling. One afternoon, I caught Skylar using my professional-grade ultrasonic cleaner to wash her cheap costume jewelry. When I asked her to be careful with the expensive machinery, Lydia stormed into the room clutching her pearls. Honestly, Cassandra, Skylar is trying to learn the family trade. You should be encouraging her, not treating her like a common intruder in her own brother's house. The fact that it was my house paid for by my inheritance seemed to be a detail they had collectively erased from their memories. The tension reached a boiling point during the third year of our marriage when a prestigious client, Mrs. Sterling, entrusted me with a rare 15-carat Victorian sapphire ring for restoration. It was a museum-quality piece with an intricate filigree setting that required weeks of microscopic work. I kept it in a reinforced biometric safe inside my home studio. One Tuesday evening, after a particularly grueling session, I went to retrieve the ring for a final polish, only to find the velvet box empty. My heart plummeted. I searched every inch of the studio, my hands trembling. Panic set in. This wasn't just about money. My entire professional reputation was on the line. I found Skylar in the living room, casually scrolling through her phone while wearing a pair of my silk pajamas. When I asked if she had been in my studio, she didn't even look up. "I just went in to get some tape for a package, Cassie. Calm down. It's not like you're guarding the crown jewels." Her casual tone felt wrong. Later that night, I noticed a post on her private Instagram account, a blurry mirror selfie of her at a downtown bar flaunting a massive blue stone on her right hand. It was unmistakable. She hadn't just taken it. She was parading it around Savannah's nightlife as if it were her own. I confronted Dominic, immediately showing him the screenshot. I expected him to be horrified to demand she return it at once. Instead, he let out a tired sigh and rubbed his temples. "Cassie, honey, you're overreacting. Skylar probably just borrowed it for the night to feel special. You know how hard her breakup has been. She's just a kid." "A kid, Dominic. She's 24. She took a client's $100,000 heirloom. If Mrs. Sterling finds out, I'm finished." I shouted, my voice cracking with a mix of fury and fear. Lydia appeared in the doorway like a ghost of Southern judgment. "There is no need for such hysterics, Cassandra. Dominic is right. The girl has had a difficult month. Besides, if your security was so easily bypassed by a child, perhaps the fault lies with your own negligence. We are family. We protect one another. We don't call the authorities on our own blood over a piece of old glass." "Old glass? It's a certified sapphire." "Lydia," I retorted, but Dominic stepped between us, putting his hands on my shoulders. His touch, once comforting, now felt like a heavy weight. "I'll handle it, Cassie. I'll get it back from her in the morning. Let's not make a scene. It'll stay within the family. No harm, no foul." Right. He did get the ring back the next day, but it was tossed onto my workbench without an apology. Skylar didn't speak to me for a week, acting as if I was the one who had offended her. That was the moment the scales finally fell from my eyes. I realized I wasn't a wife to Dominic. I was an ATM with a pulse. I wasn't a daughter-in-law to Lydia. I was a social ladder she was using to climb out of the hole her own husband had dug. And Skylar. She was a predator in training, protected by a mother who viewed my hard work as their collective birthright. I lay awake that night listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, realizing that every cent I earned was being funneled into a bottomless pit of Montgomery greed. I had built an empire for a man who would gladly watch me drown if it meant he could keep his Rolex dry. I didn't say a word the next morning. I made breakfast, smiled at their jokes, and even bought Lydia that designer handbag she had been hinting about. But inside, the restoration expert in me was beginning a new project. I was going to restore my own life, and the first step was making sure that when this porcelain family finally shattered, I wouldn't be the one picking up the pieces. Trust is a fragile thing, much like the 18th century Venetian glass I spent my afternoons stabilizing in my workshop. Once it's shattered, no amount of high-grade resin can hide the fractures. Following the incident with Mrs. Sterling's sapphire, I stopped believing in Dominic's excuses and started believing in digital evidence. I spent a small fortune on high-definition security cameras disguised as sleek smoke detectors and air purifiers, placing them strategically throughout my private quarters and the inner sanctum of my studio. For weeks, I watched the footage during my late-night sessions, expecting to catch Skylar stealing petty cash or Lydia rifling through my mail. I never expected to see a stranger parading through my bedroom as if she had already picked out the new curtains. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I first saw her on my laptop screen. A young woman with artificially blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed fast fashion was lounging on my Egyptian cotton sheets. This was Bianca Caldwell, a local social media consultant Dominic had supposedly hired to revamp his real estate brand. In reality, she was consulting on how to dismantle my life. The footage showed Dominic giving her a guided tour of our home, pointing to my antique French armoire and my collection of rare Art Deco lamps with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, baby." Dominic's voice came through the crystal-clear audio. "Once the legal transfer for the studio is finalized, this whole place will be yours. Cassandra is too buried in her dusty relics to notice we've already moved on." Bianca giggled, a high-pitched grating sound that felt like a drill to my ears. "I hope so, Dom. I'm tired of meeting you in those dingy motels. But are you sure she'll sign the papers? She seems protective of her work." Dominic laughed, pouring 2 glasses of my vintage Bordeaux, the one I had been saving for our 10th anniversary. "Cassie. She's a pushover. I've spent years making her feel like she's the unstable one. By the time I'm done with the restructuring plan, she'll be thanking me for taking the burden off her hands." Hearing him describe my passion, my career, and my life's work as a burden felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't just an affair. It was a hostile takeover of my entire existence. The true horror, however, occurred when they moved toward my walk-in closet. Bianca emerged minutes later wearing a vintage emerald green silk dress, the very dress my mother had worn to her own engagement party 40 years ago. It was a masterpiece of mid-century couture, preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag to protect the delicate fibers. Bianca was twirling in front of my full-length mirror, struggling with the zipper, because she clearly lacked my mother's graceful frame. "This looks so much better on me than it would on that museum curator," Bianca sneered, referring to me with a condescending smirk. "It's a bit tight in the bust, but I'll have it tailored once she's out of the picture." Lydia Montgomery then entered the frame, not with a reprimand, but with a wide, approving smile. She walked up to Bianca and adjusted the silk collar of my mother's dress. "Green has always been your color, dear. It highlights the Montgomery eyes, or it will eventually." Cassandra always looked a bit too clinical in such fine fabrics. She never understood that luxury is meant to be lived in, not displayed like an exhibit. Seeing my mother-in-law validate this theft, this desecration of a dead woman's memory ignited a cold, silent fire in my veins. The Montgomerys weren't just parasites. They were opportunists in designer shoes. As the afternoon progressed on the screen, the three of them sat around my dining table, the one I had hand-polished for 10 hours, and began reviewing a stack of legal documents. I zoomed in on the high-resolution feed. I recognized the letterhead of a cut-rate legal firm in the suburbs. They were drafting a business consolidation agreement. The plan was sinister. In its simplicity, Dominic intended to merge my independent restoration studio into a newly formed Montgomery Heritage Group. As the CEO, Dominic would have total control over the assets, the intellectual property, and, most importantly, the bank accounts. He was planning to use my professional reputation to secure high-interest loans to pay off his gambling debts, leaving me as a mere employee in a company I had built from the ground up. "If we time this right," Lydia said, tapping a manicured finger on the table, "we can have the sheriff serve the eviction notice the same day the studio assets are frozen. She won't have the liquid capital to hire a decent lawyer. She'll be forced to take whatever settlement you offered just to keep her tools." Dominic nodded, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone. "Exactly. And since I've been helping her with the books for the last 2 years, I've made sure there are enough inconsistencies to make her look like she has been embezzling from her own clients. It's an insurance policy in case she tries to fight back." I sat in the darkness of my workshop, the only sound being the distant hum of my air purifier. I realized that my marriage hadn't just been a failure, it had been an elaborate, long con. Every "I love you," every supportive hug after a long day, every anniversary dinner had been a calculated move to lower my defenses. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a high-yield investment that was finally maturing. I watched as Bianca poured another glass of my wine and accidentally spilled a drop on the white Persian rug. She didn't even try to clean it. She just laughed and covered it with a decorative pillow. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The pain was still there, sharp and jagged, but it was being rapidly covered by a thick layer of professional detachment. I was an expert at restoration. I knew how to identify rot hidden beneath layers of beautiful gold leaf. I knew how to stabilize a crumbling structure before it collapsed entirely. The Montgomerys thought they were the masterminds of this drama, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who knew how to work with the finest tools. I knew how to dismantle something so precisely that the person holding it wouldn't even realize it was falling apart until it was a pile of dust in their hands. I didn't storm into the house. I didn't scream or throw their bags onto the lawn. That would have been too easy, and it would have given them the unstable wife narrative they so desperately craved for their legal battle. Instead, I carefully saved the footage to 3 different cloud servers and an encrypted thumb drive. I then pulled up my contact list and scrolled down to a name I hadn't called in years: Nathaniel Thorne. Nate was the smartest, most ruthless financial lawyer in D.C., and more importantly, he owed my mother a debt of gratitude that he had been waiting decades to repay. I took one last look at the screen. Bianca was now trying on my mother's pearls, pouting for a selfie, while Dominic cheered her on. "Enjoy the dress while you can, Bianca," I whispered to the empty room, "because by the time I'm finished, you won't even be able to afford the polyester version." I closed my laptop, wiped a single stray tear from my cheek, and picked up the phone. It was time to stop restoring the past and start engineering a very specific kind of future, one where the Montgomerys would learn the true cost of trying to steal a legacy they could never hope to earn. The following Monday, I found myself sitting in a dimly lit corner of a quiet bistro on the outskirts of Savannah, far from the prying eyes of the Montgomery social circle. Nathaniel Thorne sat across from me, looking every bit the high-powered Washington attorney he had become. His sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the digital files I had sent him with a precision that was both comforting and terrifying. Nate hadn't changed much since we were kids. He still had that same restless energy and a legal mind that functioned like a grandmaster's chessboard. He closed his tablet and leaned back, a grim smile playing on his lips. Cassandra, your mother once saved my family from losing our home during the recession. I've been waiting for a chance to settle that score. If these Montgomerys want a war, we're going to give them a revolution. Nate explained that simply filing for divorce wouldn't be enough. Because Dominic had spent years mingling our finances and assisting with the studio's bookkeeping, he had created a legal labyrinth designed to trap my assets. He wants the studio because he thinks it's a gold mine, Nate said, tapping a pen against the table. He's already leveraged your future earnings to secure loans for his failing real estate ventures. If you just walk away, he'll liquidate everything you've built to pay off his debts. We need to let him take the studio, Cassandra, but we're going to make sure that by the time he realizes what he actually owns, it'll be too late to stop the collapse. The plan was as elegant as a Victorian clockwork mechanism. For the next 3 months, I became a ghost in my own home, playing the role of the dutiful, exhausted wife, while transforming my workshop into a laboratory of deception. My specialty in restoration gave me a unique, albeit dangerous skill. I knew exactly how to create fakes that could fool even a semi-trained eye. I began with the most valuable pieces in my inventory, the ones Dominic had already promised to his creditors. There was a 17th century French writing desk, a masterpiece of marquetry and gold leaf. Night after night, while the house slept, I meticulously crafted a replica using distressed wood and modern veneers that I aged with chemical washes and strategic bruising. Dominic would often wander into the studio late at night, swirling a glass of bourbon and looking at my work with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "That desk is going to be our ticket to the big leagues. Cassie," he would say, leaning against the doorframe. "I've got a buyer in Palm Beach who's willing to pay $200,000 for it. You're doing a great job, honey. Just keep focusing on the finishing touches." I would offer him a weary smile, my heart pounding as I worked on the hidden compartment of the replica. "I'm doing my best, Dominic. It's a lot of work for one person." He never noticed the difference. To him, art was just a dollar sign with legs. He didn't understand the soul of the wood or the specific weight of genuine gold leaf. He was so blinded by his own greed that he couldn't see the woman he had spent 7 years with was systematically dismantling his future right under his nose. Skylar Montgomery was even easier to deceive. She started spending more time in the studio acting like an eager apprentice, but actually looking for small items she could borrow for her social circle. I began leaving out baubles that looked expensive, but were actually high-quality stage props I had sourced from a theater supply house. One afternoon, I watched her through the workshop's reflected glass as she slipped a diamond-encrusted brooch into her pocket. It was actually cubic zirconia set in polished brass worth about $50. "Oh, Cassie," she chirped, pretending to examine a pile of sandpaper. "Mom was saying we should have a gala here once we take over the management. You look so tired. You really need a vacation. Don't worry, Dominic and I will handle the inventory from now on." I nodded, suppressing a laugh. "That's very kind of you, Skylar. I think I would like a long rest." While I was swapping the physical assets, Nathaniel was busy with the digital ones. He helped me set up a series of offshore trusts and restructured my partnership in the National Preservation Society. We buried the true ownership of my most lucrative patents and restoration techniques under layers of intellectual property filings that were registered in my maiden name. Meanwhile, I allowed Dominic to help me draft the new management agreement he had been pushing for. I intentionally left errors in the document legal loopholes that Nate had crafted to look like my own negligence. To a discount lawyer like Dominic's, it looked like I was handing over the keys to the kingdom. In reality, I was handing him a ticking financial time bomb. Lydia was the final piece of the puzzle. She had started bringing investors, mostly her elderly wealthy friends, to the house to show off the family business. One evening, she stood in the center of my workshop gesturing toward a row of restored Ming-style vases. As you can see, our family has a deep-seated passion for the arts, she told a group of wide-eyed socialites. My son is taking over the administrative side to allow our artisan to focus on the labor. She said the word artisan as if it were a polite term for a professional. What she didn't know was that those vases were high-end reproductions I had bought at a home decor outlet and aged with a mixture of tea and charcoal. The originals were already safely tucked away in a climate-controlled storage unit in Nate's name 3 states away. The tension in the house was palpable, a thick layer of unspoken betrayal that felt like a fog. Dominic and Bianca were becoming bolder often, whispering in the hallways about their plans for the renovation of the studio once I was gone. Bianca even had the audacity to ask me for my secret recipe for the wood varnish I used. I want to make sure the brand stays consistent, she said, popping her chewing gum. I gave her a recipe, all right, a mixture of low-grade linseed oil and a specific type of walnut stain that would look beautiful for exactly 6 months before it started to peel and turn a muddy gray. It was the perfect metaphor for their relationship, shiny on the outside, but chemically destined to fall apart. By the end of the 3rd month, the studio was a shell. Every genuine masterpiece had been replaced by a meticulously crafted echo. My bank accounts were empty, the funds legally transferred into a trust for future business development that only Nate and I could access. I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. I was like a master restorer who had found a way to save the painting by burning the canvas it was trapped on. I was ready. I had the recordings of their schemes, I had the legal safety net Nate had woven for me, and I had the absolute certainty that the people I called family were my worst enemies. Dominic came to me the next evening with a stack of papers and a bottle of cheap champagne. "It's time, Cassie," he said, his voice brimming with a triumph he hadn't earned. "Let's make this official. Let's build our legacy." I looked at him, the man I had once loved, the man who was currently planning to leave me with nothing, and I felt nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. "Yes, Dominic," I said, reaching for the pen. "Let's finally give you exactly what you deserve." As I signed the first document, I thought of my mother's letter, "Never let anyone dim your light." I wasn't just keeping my light, I was about to set their entire world on fire. The air in the Savannah mansion felt heavy like the breathless stillness before a coastal hurricane. It was a Friday evening, and the Montgomerys had decided it was time to move from subtle financial draining to overt theft. Dominic had arranged a family meeting in the formal dining room, the very place where he had once toasted to our forever. Now the mahogany table was covered not with crystal and lace, but with cold clinical legal documents. Dominic sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of false concern, while Lydia stood behind him like a royal consort, and Schuyler leaned against the sideboard sipping a cocktail she had made with my most expensive gin. They were ready to deliver the final blow, unaware that I had been sharpening my own blade for months. "Cassie, honey." Dominic began, his voice practiced and smooth. "We need to talk about the future of the studio. The audits I've been running show some troubling discrepancies. It looks like you've been overextending the firm's credit lines, and the debt is becoming unmanageable. If we don't act now, the bank will move to seize the mansion and your entire inventory." This was the opening move of his long-planned gaslighting campaign. He was blaming me for the very debts he had secretly accumulated. He pushed a thick folder toward me. "I've had my legal team draft a consolidation agreement. It moves the studio's liabilities into a holding company. All you have to do is sign this acknowledgement of debt transfer. It'll protect you from personal bankruptcy, Cassie. I'm doing this to save you." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling with a performance that would have won an Oscar. I let a single well-timed tear track down my cheek. Debt transfer. But Dominic, I've worked so hard. I thought we were doing well. I looked up at Lydia, searching for a shred of humanity that I knew didn't exist. Lydia, please. This is my mother's legacy. Is there no other way? Lydia let out a long theatrical sigh, adjusting her silk scarf. Oh, Cassandra, don't be so dramatic. You've always been better at the manual labor than the business side of things. Dominic is a Montgomery. He has a natural instinct for finance that you simply lack. Just sign the papers and let the men handle the heavy lifting. You can spend more time at the club once this is all settled. Skylar chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Yeah, Cassie. Think of it as a retirement. You've looked so haggard lately. All that sawdust can't be good for your complexion. Just sign and we can all move on. They were so eager, so blinded by the prospect of my surrender, that they didn't notice the subtle shift in the documents Nate and I had prepared. Tucked neatly between the standard debt acknowledgement pages was a very specific affidavit of financial management. In the complex world of American tax law, this document was a lethal weapon. By signing it, Dominic wasn't just taking the studio, he was legally declaring under penalty of perjury that he had been the sole financial officer and decision-maker for the past 5 years. He was effectively telling the Internal Revenue Service that every penny spent, every tax deduction claimed, and every offshore investment was his personal responsibility. I picked up the pen, my fingers shaking. If I sign this, you promise the studio stays in the family name. Dominic's eyes lit up with a predatory hunger. I promise, Cassie. It'll be the Montgomery Heritage Group. You have my word. I let out a choked sob and scribbled my signature on the first 3 pages. I feel like I'm giving up my soul, I whispered. Dominic practically ripped the folder back toward him. You're doing the right thing, honey. Now I just need to co-sign these as the new managing partner to make it official. He didn't even read the fine print on the 4th page, the one that Nate had titled Asset Alignment Schedule. To a layman, it looked like a list of equipment. To the IRS, it was a detailed confession of commingling personal debts with corporate funds. Dominic signed his name with a flourish, his signature large and arrogant. He felt like he had just won the lottery. There, he said, slamming the folder shut. It's done. We'll start the transition on Monday. Why don't you go upstairs and get some rest? You look like you need it. He was already pulling out his phone, likely texting Bianca Caldwell to tell her the old lady had finally cracked. I stood up, leaning against the table for support, still playing the role of the broken woman. Thank you, Dominic. I don't know what I would have done without you. Lydia patted my hand condescendingly. That's a good girl. Run along now. As soon as I was out of their sight and inside my locked bedroom, the mask shattered. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I immediately pulled out my burner phone and sent a one-word message to Nathaniel: executed. The legal trap was now set. While Dominic was busy celebrating his victory with my expensive wine in the dining room, the digital copies of those signed affidavits were being uploaded to a secure portal for the federal tax authorities. In the United States, the IRS is the one entity you never ever try to outsmart. By claiming sole financial control, Dominic had just inherited a $3 million tax liability that I had carefully documented over the years, debts he had incurred by using business accounts for his private gambling and luxury gifts for his mistress. I spent the next hour packing my remaining essentials into a single sturdy suitcase. I took my mother's handwritten journals, my primary restoration tools, and the original deed to her small cottage in the North Carolina mountains, a property the Montgomerys didn't even know existed. I looked around the room I had shared with a man who was a stranger to me. I felt a profound sense of relief. The house, the furniture, the status. It was all just wood and fabric. The true value was already gone, replaced by the replicas I had spent months perfecting. They were welcome to the shell I was leaving behind. Downstairs, I could hear them laughing. Skylar was playing loud music and Lydia was already talking about which walls she wanted to tear down to modernize the foyer. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness. They believed that because I was kind, I was weak. They believed that because I was an artist, I was stupid. They had forgotten that a restorer's greatest skill is the ability to see through layers of deception to find the truth beneath. I walked down the back staircase, avoiding the foyer where they were celebrating. As I reached the side door, I stopped for a moment to look at the grandfather clock. It was nearly midnight. In exactly 48 hours, the first wave of frozen account notices would hit Dominic's phone. The IRS would move with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a mountain glacier. They would find the inconsistencies Dominic had so arrogantly signed off on, and they would hold him personally liable for every cent. There would be no corporate shield to protect him, no mother's name to hide behind. He had signed his own financial death warrant, and he had done it with a smile on his face. I stepped out into the cool Savannah night. A light rain had begun to fall, washing away the dust of the life I was leaving behind. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who had just completed her most difficult restoration project yet. I was no longer Cassandra Montgomery, the wife of a struggling realtor. I was Cassandra, the woman who had protected her mother's light by letting her enemies fall by their own greed. I walked toward my car, the keys clutched tightly in my hand. The Montgomerys were about to learn a very expensive lesson: you should never try to steal a legacy from someone who knows exactly how to build one. Leaving Savannah felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin that I had outgrown years ago. As I crossed the state line, the humid, moss-draped air of the coast gave way to the crisp, liberating breeze of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spent the first year in total anonymity, living in my mother's secluded cottage and reconnecting with the quiet joy of restoration, this time restoring my own spirit. I changed my professional name to Cassandra Thorne, using Nathaniel's surname as a shield, while he handled the fallout of my departure. While I was waking up to the sound of birds and the smell of fresh cedar, Dominic Montgomery was waking up to a reality that was rapidly decomposing around him. The collapse began not with a bang, but with a series of frozen notifications on Dominic's smartphone just 48 hours after I vanished. Nathaniel had been meticulous. The signed affidavits Dominic so arrogantly provided were delivered to the IRS, triggering an immediate and aggressive audit of his entire financial history. Because he had legally declared himself the sole financial architect of our combined ventures, the corporate veil he intended to hide behind vanished instantly. The authorities didn't see a successful businessman. They saw a man who had systematically diverted business funds for gambling, luxury travel, and a mistress's lifestyle without paying a cent in payroll or corporate taxes. Within 6 months, every account associated with the Montgomery name was flagged, and the Savannah mansion became an expensive burden they could no longer maintain. Dominic's attempt to run the restoration studio was an even bigger comedy of errors. He and Bianca Caldwell, who had officially moved into my bedroom a week after I left, truly believed that my business was as easy as putting a fresh coat of paint on an old chair. Their first major blunder occurred when Mrs. Sterling returned for a consultation on a rare French commode. Dominic, eager for a quick payday to cover his mounting legal fees, sold her a piece from the floor, the very replica I had aged with walnut stain and low-grade oil. 3 months later, when the antique began to peel and the glue started to warp in the Georgia humidity, Mrs. Sterling returned with 2 lawyers and an independent appraiser. The discovery that the Montgomery Heritage Group was selling high-priced fakes sent a shockwave through Savannah's elite society. The lawsuits didn't just rain, they poured. The family's reaction to their looming poverty was a spectacle of desperation. Lydia Montgomery began a pathetic campaign on social media to smear my name. She posted tearful videos on Old South heritage groups claiming I had kidnapped the family fortune and abandoned a vulnerable, aging woman in her hour of need. She even had the audacity to claim I was the one who had swapped the antiques for fakes before I fled. Her followers ate it up at first, but the internet is a double-edged sword. When Bianca Caldwell tried to join in by posting photos of herself in my mother's jewelry to show how happy she and Dominic were, Nathaniel released a single devastating piece of evidence: the high-definition security footage of Bianca and Skylar laughing about taking my mother's heirlooms. The public backlash was instantaneous. Bianca's social media consultant career vanished overnight. Her followers turned on her with a ferocity that was almost poetic. Dominic's desperation reached a fever pitch when he tried to auction off my mother's genuine paintings, only to find that Nate had already filed a lease pendens on every asset in the house, claiming they were stolen property. Every time Dominic tried to sell a chair or a lamp to pay for his scotch, he found himself blocked by a legal wall that Nathaniel had spent years preparing. Skylar's downfall was the most definitive. Deprived of my bank account and facing the constant pressure of her brother's failure, she returned to her old habits. She was caught on a hidden camera at a boutique hotel downtown, trying to swipe a designer handbag from a tourist's luggage. Because she was already under investigation for the sapphire theft, the judge showed no mercy. Lydia's fragile porcelain doll was sentenced to 18 months in a state correctional facility for felony theft and conspiracy. I heard through the grapevine that Lydia fainted in the courtroom not out of grief for her daughter, but because the local newspaper caught her wearing a department store knockoff dress to the hearing. By the end of the second year, the Savannah mansion was foreclosed upon. The Old South legacy the Montgomerys had tried to build on my back was sold at a public auction to a developer who planned to turn it into a boutique hotel. Dominic moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment, sharing this space with a bitter aging Lydia and an increasingly resentful Bianca. The three of them spent their evenings arguing about whose fault it was. Dominic was forced to take a job as a low-level car salesman, a position where his charming drawl only earned him glares from people who recognized him as the man who had defrauded half of Savannah. Meanwhile, my life was flourishing in a way I never thought possible. With Nathaniel's help, I moved to Washington, D.C., and opened a boutique consultancy for national museums. I was no longer the pushover wife or the ATM with a pulse. I was Cassandra Thorne, a woman whose professional integrity was unshakable and whose bank account was finally legally and entirely mine. I spent my weekends visiting Skylar's replacement, a rescue dog, who actually appreciated the Egyptian cotton sheets, and reading my mother's letters by the fireplace. The Montgomerys tried to reach me, of course. Dominic sent dozens of emails alternating between professions of undying love and threats of further lawsuits. He even had the gall to ask for a loan to help pay for Skylar's legal appeal. I never replied. I simply forwarded every communication to Nate, who archived them for a future harassment case. They were like ghosts from a past life, hollow and powerless, their voices drowned out by the sound of my own success. The final irony came when Lydia tried to start a blog titled The Graceful Exile. She was quickly shut down by a cease and desist order because she was using my professional copyrighted images to illustrate her sophistication. She had spent her whole life trying to dim my light, never realizing that without me to reflect it, she was just an old woman standing in the dark. As I prepared for the third anniversary of my departure, I received an invitation that felt like the final piece of a restoration project. It was for the Federal Preservation Gala, the most exclusive event in the nation's capital, where the world's most influential leaders gathered to honor those who protected the nation's heritage. As I saw a familiar, desperate name among the wait-listed applicants who were trying to bribe their way into a sponsorship, I knew the time for the final reveal had come. The Montgomerys wanted a seat at the table. They were about to find out that I was the one who owned the room. The National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., was transformed into a cathedral of light and power for the Federal Preservation Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the nation's elite billionaires, senators, and global cultural leaders all gathered to honor the person responsible for the most significant heritage restoration initiative of the decade. I stood on the mezzanine balcony looking down at the sea of black ties and silk gowns. I was wearing a custom-made midnight blue velvet dress paired with my mother's original Cartier watch, which Nathaniel had successfully recovered during the final legal sweep. I was no longer a restorer hidden in a dusty Savannah workshop. I was the executive director of the National Heritage Trust. Below me, the double doors of the ballroom opened, and I spotted two figures who looked like fading shadows in a room full of stars. Dominic and Lydia Montgomery had somehow managed to procure observer passes, likely by spending their last few dollars to bribe a low-level event coordinator. They looked pathetic. Dominic's once-tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, the fabric frayed at the cuffs. Lydia was wearing a dress that was a decade out of style, her neck stiff with a desperate pride that no longer had an audience. They were here to find a benefactor, a white knight, to save them from the mountain of debt and the civil lawsuits that were suffocating what remained of their lives. As the chime rang for the keynote address, the crowd moved toward the central stage. Dominic was whispering feverishly to Lydia, gesturing toward the VIP tables. "If we can just get a minute with the director," he hissed, unaware that his voice was being picked up by the nearby security detail. "I can explain our Savannah expertise. We can get the studio back." Lydia nodded, her eyes darting around with a predatory hunger. "Yes, darling. Remind them of our family name. A Montgomery belongs in a room like this." It was a delusion of grandeur so profound it was almost humorous. They were standing in a room full of self-made giants still trying to trade on a name that was now synonymous with failure. The master of ceremonies took the stage, his voice echoing through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce the woman whose vision has revitalized our nation's history. Please welcome the executive director of the National Heritage Trust, Cassandra Thorne." A thunderous applause erupted, filling the room. I walked down the grand staircase, the light catching the emeralds in my earrings. I saw the moment they recognized me. It was as if the air had been sucked out of their lungs. Dominic's jaw dropped so far it looked painful, and Lydia's hand flew to her throat, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray. Their artisan wife, the woman they had thrown out into the rain with a single suitcase, was now the gatekeeper of the very world they were trying to infiltrate. I walked past the front rows, my gaze fixed forward. As I reached the podium, Dominic made a desperate move. He broke through the velvet rope, stumbling toward the stage with Lydia trailing behind him. "Cassandra!" He shouted, his voice cracking with hope and terror. "Cassie, it's me, Dominic. We had a misunderstanding. Please tell these people who we are. Tell them we're partners." Security intercepted them immediately, but I raised a hand, signaling the guards to wait. The room went deathly silent. Every powerful eye in the building was now on the two disheveled strangers shivering at the foot of the stage. Dominic fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out toward me. "Please, Cassie. The authorities took everything. Mom is sick. We didn't mean any of it. It was just business stress. We're family, remember? You can't leave us like this." Lydia joined him, her knees hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. The grand dame of Savannah was now sobbing openly, her mascara running down her wrinkled cheeks. "Cassandra, dear, forgive us. We were foolish. You were always the heart of our home. Please, just one signature, just one word to the authorities to drop the charges." I looked down at them from the stage. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to scream or gloat. All I felt was a profound crystalline silence. I remembered the night I signed those papers in Savannah while they laughed in the dining room. I remembered the way they called my mother's legacy depressing. I remembered the cold rain on my face as I drove away with nothing. I leaned into the microphone, my voice calm, steady, and amplified for everyone to hear. I'm sorry. I said, my tone as cold as a winter morning. But I don't believe we've met. Security, please escort these strangers out. They are trespassing at a private event. The gasps from the audience were like a wave. Dominic tried to scream my name again, but the guards were efficient. They were hoisted up and dragged toward the exit, their cries for mercy, echoing off the high ceilings until the heavy oak doors swung shut, erasing them from the room and from my life forever. There was no reconciliation. There was no second chance. I had spent 6 years being their safety net, and the moment I stepped aside, they fell into the pit they had dug for themselves. That wasn't revenge. It was the natural law of the universe finally asserting itself. I finished my speech to a standing ovation, but my mind was already elsewhere. I was thinking about the restoration of a soul. We often think that being strong means holding on, but as I stood there in the center of that magnificent room, I realized that true strength is the ability to let go. It's the wisdom to know when a structure is too rotten to save, and the courage to walk away before it collapses on you. I had protected my mother's light by refusing to let it be extinguished by people who only knew how to live in the shadows. As the night wound down, I stood on the balcony one last time, looking out at the Washington Monument. I felt a sense of peace that no amount of money or status could ever buy. I had my name, my mother's journals, and a future that I had built with my own hands. The Montgomerys were now just a footnote in a much larger story, a story of a woman who learned that loyalty to the wrong people is just another form of self-destruction. Justice, I realized, isn't always a gavel in a courtroom. Sometimes it's just the quiet sound of a door closing on the people who never deserve to walk through it with you. To my wonderful audience, especially those of you who have walked a long road and faced your own Montgomerys in life, I want to say thank you. This story is a reminder that your worth is not defined by how others treat you, but by the strength you find to stand back up when they try to push you down. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a weakness or that your hard work belongs to anyone but yourself. Life has a way of balancing the scales, but you have to be the one brave enough to step onto the scale first. Thank you for listening to my journey from the rain of Savannah to the lights of D.C. If this story touched your heart or gave you a bit of a laugh at the expense of those who deserved it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to keep sharing these tales of justice and transformation. Drop a comment below and let me know, what would you have done if they knelt before you? Would you have been as silent as Cassandra? Or would you have had one last word to say? I read every single one of your comments, and they inspire me to make the next story even better. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder of their own power today. Stay strong, stay healthy, and may your own light always shine bright. This is Cassandra signing off.